Welcome to another Ziva Math video. In this video on adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators, I will work through some examples using the tips and options I give my students for finding a common denominator. While finding the least common denominator is encouraged, the truth is, as long as you can find any common denominator, you can get started on any addition and subtraction of fractions problem. Let's look at some examples. Our first example, we have 4/5 minus 1/6. We have unlike denominators, so our first step has to be to find a common denominator. And as we just said, ideally you want your least common denominator. And we can do this by looking at our multiples. We want the least common multiple between our two denominators. And so I've made the list of multiples for 5 and our multiples of 6, and we want the least common multiple here. So the smallest number that's in both lists is 30, so 30 is our least common denominator. And if you want more detailed instructions on using this method, we do have a video in our fractions playlist, how to find the least common denominator, which walks you through all of these steps. So our common denominator here is going to be 30. So I'm going to get that set up because I need to make equivalent fractions that have this common denominator of 30. So that first question is, what did I multiply the 5 by to get 30? And because I wrote my multiples out, I can number those multiples. So 5 times 1 was 5, 5 times 2 was 10. And if I number those, then I can see that 5 times 6 is 30. Or you just have your multiplication facts memorized and you know that 5 times 6 is 30. And so if I'm making equivalent fractions, whatever I multiply that denominator by, I have to multiply that numerator by the same thing. So 4 times 6 is 24. So 24 is the numerator. So 4/5 equals 24/30. Haven't changed anything in the problem. I just got a common denominator and made an equivalent fraction. And we're going to do the same thing for the 1/6. What did I multiply the 6 by to get 30? Well, again, if I've listed my multiples, I can just number them. 6 times 5 is 30. 30 is that fifth multiple there. And whatever I multiply my denominator by, I have to multiply the numerator by the same thing to make an equivalent fraction. So I'm also going to multiply that numerator 1 times 5 to get the numerator. So 1 times 5 is 5, and I am subtracting. I've got a common denominator, so now I can just subtract my numerators. 24 minus 5 is 19. My denominator of 30 remains the same. They don't need to simplify, so 4/5 minus 1/6 is 19/30. Using this least common multiple to find our common denominator may take a little bit of time. So let's look at some ways we can use this idea, but possibly not write out as many of our multiples. So this time we have 3/5 plus 2/15, and we're going to need a common denominator. And ideally we want the least common denominator. So if we start looking at our multiples of 15, 15 is the first one. And so then I can look at 5. I know 15 is a multiple of 5 because that last digit is a 5. So then I can list my multiples of 5 till I get to 15. Or I can just use 15 as that least common denominator. And so then I'm going to need to set up to make equivalent fractions with a common denominator of 15. And so what did we multiply 5 by to get 15? Well, 5 times 3 is 15. And whatever I multiply my denominator by, I need to multiply the numerator by. So 3 times 3 is 9. And then 2/15 already has the denominator of 15, so I don't have to do anything to it. Now I have 9/15 plus 2/15. Common denominator, so I can add my numerators. 9 plus 2 is 11. My denominator of 15 remains 15, and I can't simplify. So 3/5 plus 2/15 equals 11/15. So again, you can use your knowledge and your multiplication facts to come up with that least common multiple and that least common denominator. My next example, I have 3/4 plus 7/10. And this one we can think about similar to that previous example. We want our least common denominator, which means we would be using our least common multiple. But we do know some things about multiples of 10. We know that every multiple of 10 has to end in 0. When I look at multiples of 4, I'm going to want the first multiple of 4 that ends in 0. So if I start listing those out, I get 4, 8, 12, 16, and 20 will be that first multiple. Or I know my multiplication facts and I already know that 4 times 5 is 20. So 20 is that least common multiple, so it's going to be the least common denominator. And ideally, remember, that's what you're looking for. So we have denominators of 20, and I'm going to need my equivalent fractions with denominators of 20. So 4 times 5 is 20. And whatever I multiplied my denominator by, I need to multiply my numerator by the same thing in order to have an equivalent fraction to 3/4. So I'm also going to multiply the numerator by 5. 3 times 5 is 15. Then I have my denominator. 10 times 2 is 20. So since I multiplied my denominator by 2, I need to multiply my numerator by 2. 7 times 2 is 14. And then I'm ready to add. Now I've got fractions with a common denominator, so I just need to add my numerators. So 15 plus 14 is 29, and that common denominator of 20 remains the same. So now I've got a sum of 29/20. That's an improper fraction, so I'm going to need to change it to a mixed number. And I do that by dividing my numerator of 29 by my denominator of 20. So I'm going to put the 29 on the inside since it needs to be divided by 20, and the 20 goes on the outside. 29 divided by 20 is 1. 1 times 20 is 20. When I subtract 29 minus 20, I get 9. And my quotient of 1 becomes my whole number in my mixed number. My remainder of 9 becomes the numerator, and the denominator of 20 remains 20. So 3/4 plus 7/10 equals 1 and 9/20. The other way that you can think about this problem is once you have your multiples of 10, so we had 10, 20, and 30. Can I multiply 4 by anything and get 10? And the answer to that is no. Can I multiply 4 by anything and get 20? And the answer to that is yes. 4 times 5 is 20. So that would be another way to look at coming up with this common denominator in this example. The next problem we have is 1/6 minus 1/9. We've said that using the least common denominator is ideal, but it's not your only option. With the denominators of 6 and 9, there are plenty of multiples they have in common, so there is more than one option for a common denominator. I always tell my students, rather than worry about making sure you have the least common denominator, if you recognize that you can use 36 for a common denominator, then you can get the problem started. So let's go ahead and use 36 as that common denominator. We need to think about what 6 times what is 36. 6 times 6 is 36, because if we're going to make equivalent fractions, then I need to multiply that numerator by the same number, 6. So 1 times 6 is 6. And the same thing for 1/9. If we're going to use 36 as a common denominator, we multiplied 9 by 4 to get to 36. So if I'm going to have an equivalent fraction, I need to multiply 1 times 4 to come up with my numerator. 1 times 4 is 4, and we are subtracting. Now that I've got common denominators, I'm subtracting my numerators. 6 minus 4 is 2, and that denominator remains the same. Then I need to go through the same questions of, can I simplify? Well, if I've got two even numbers, then I do know that they at least share a common factor of 2, so I can simplify. Whatever I divide my numerator by, I have to divide my denominator by the same thing to simplify. So 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 36 divided by 2 is 18. So 1/6 minus 1/9 is 1/18. So just to recap, while the least common denominator is ideal, you can use any common denominator that you recognize to be able to complete the problem, as you will get to the same answer in the end. Often I've had my own students get stuck trying to find a common denominator. If you find listing multiples or using your knowledge of multiplication facts difficult for finding a common denominator, you can always multiply the denominators together to get a common denominator. And remember, just getting a common denominator allows you to get the problem started, and you'll still get to the same answer in the end. We'll use this method in our last two examples. In the example 1/6 plus 3/10, we have denominators of 6 and 10. 6 times 10 is 60, so we can use 60 as that common denominator. And again, it may not be your least common denominator, but it at least gets your problem started. So 6 times 10 was 60, and to get that equivalent fraction, I have to multiply my numerator by 10 as well. So 1 times 10 is 10. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the 3/10. I multiplied 10 by 6 to get to 60. And so then I'll need to multiply the 3 by 6 as well in order to create a equivalent fraction. 3 times 6 is 18. And now that I have fractions with common denominators, I'm ready to add. So I'm adding the numerators. 10 plus 18 is 28, and my denominator, that common denominator of 60, is my denominator in my sum. And then I need to ask myself, can I simplify? Well, I've got at least two even numbers, so they at least share that common factor. If you see a larger factor that they have in common besides 2, ideally that's what you want to use. But if you just notice that they're even, 28 divided by 2 is 14, and 60 divided by 2 is 30. Then again, I need to ask myself, am I done simplifying? Well, they're both still even, so I can use that common factor of 2 again to continue simplifying. And that's one thing you'll need to remember with this method is to make sure, do I need to simplify and am I all the way done? So dividing 14 by 2, I get 7. 30 divided by 2 is 15. So 1/6 plus 3/10 equals 7/15. For our next example, we have 2/3 plus 5/8, and I'm going to use that same method of multiplying my denominators together to come up with my common denominator. So my denominator of 3 and 8, 3 times 8 is 24, so I can use 24 as that common denominator. So to make my equivalent fractions, I multiply the 3 by 8 to get to 24. So I need to multiply my numerator of 2 times 8 to get my numerator in my equivalent fraction. 2 times 8 is 16. Then I'm going to do the same thing for 5/8. I multiplied 8 by 3 to get to 24. So I need to multiply the 5 by 3 to get my numerator. 5 times 3 is 15. And this was an addition problem. So now that I have common denominators, I can add my numerators. 16 plus 15 is 31. And that common denominator of 24 is my denominator in my sum. So now I have 31/24. It's an improper fraction, so I need to turn it into a mixed number by dividing my numerator by the denominator. So top in 31, the bottom out 24. So 31 divided by 24 is 1. 1 times 24 is 24. When I subtract, I get 7. And so my quotient of 1 becomes my whole number. My remainder of 7 becomes my numerator, and my denominator of 24 remains the same. I need to ask myself, can I simplify? Well, 7/24 can't be simplified. So 2/3 plus 5/8 equals 1 and 7/24. Thank you for joining us. Be sure you like this video and subscribe for more videos by Ziva Math.